August 1943, 34,000 American and Canadian troops storm the island of Kiska in the Aleutians, and the Japanese are already gone. They evacuated 3 weeks earlier, but the fog is thick, the nerves are raw, and by the time the shooting stops, over 300 men lie dead or wounded. Every single casualty was friendly fire, the largest invasion of the Aleutian campaign fought against an enemy that was never there. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to June 1942, when the Japanese Navy struck deep into the northern Pacific. In a diversionary move tied to the Battle of Midway, Japanese forces seized the islands of Aleutian and Kiska in the Aleutian chain. It was the only part of North America that Japanese forces would occupy during the entire war. For over a year, American planners obsessed over retaking these remote islands, convinced the enemy was building a base to strike the mainland. In May 1943, American forces took Aleutian back, but the fight was brutal. Nearly 600 Americans died, retaking one small frozen island. That victory convinced the High Command that Kiska would be defended just as fiercely, and that the next invasion would be even bloodier. So the Allies planned their largest amphibious operation of the Northern Pacific, a force of 34,000 men, both American and Canadian. It was given the codename Operation Cottage, a deceptively calm name for what was about to unfold. But in late July 1943, the Japanese garrison on Kiska did something the Allies never predicted. They quietly slipped away under the cover of fog. Under the cover of that same fog, Japanese destroyers and submarines evacuated the entire garrison of over 5,000 men in a single night. The evacuation was so secret and so complete that American intelligence never detected it. The island was left entirely empty. American patrol planes flew over Kiska and saw no sign of life, but commanders dismissed it as the Japanese hiding in their tunnels. The Japanese were masters of camouflage, they reasoned. Those soldiers had to be down there, waiting in the mist. So in the last days of July, the Japanese Navy ran a rescue that historians still study today. Under cover of a thick weather front, a fleet of destroyers and submarines moved in to pull the garrison out. Over the course of a single night, more than 5,000 Japanese soldiers were ferried off the island. They left behind booby traps and dummy positions to make the island look defended and dangerous. The evacuation was so clean that American patrol planes saw nothing unusual on their flights over the island. Some intelligence officers suspected the Japanese had gone, but their warnings were brushed aside. The High Command was convinced the enemy was hiding in tunnels, waiting to spring a trap. And so, on the 15th of August 1943, the largest amphibious invasion of the Northern Pacific began. American troops stormed the beaches of Kiska, expecting to meet heavy fire from the entrenched defenders. But instead of gunfire, the first wave was met by an eerie silence and thick fog rolling off the sea. That silence did not reassure the men. It only made their nerves worse than any bombardment could have. Within hours, the first shots rang out, but they were not aimed at any Japanese soldier. Nervous troops opened fire on shadows and sounds, and soon whole units were shooting at each other. The fog made it impossible to tell friend from foe, and the fear was entirely mutual. Booby traps left by the departing Japanese added to the chaos, wounding men who tripped the wires. For 3 days, the invasion force fought a phantom enemy, and the casualties began to climb. By the second day, the confusion had spread across the entire island, and every ridge echoed with gunfire. Units that had trained together for months suddenly could not trust the men beside them in the dense fog. The Canadian brigade on the far flank reported heavy contact with what they believed was a Japanese counterattack. But the enemy they were firing at was another Canadian unit, advancing through the same blind fog. In the confusion, a naval bombardment was called in on a ridge that turned out to be held by American troops. Aboard the destroyer USS Narrated, the crew had no way to know the ridge below was friendly. The same destroyer would later strike a Japanese mine, losing more than 70 of its crew in the blast. That mine was one of the few real enemies left on Kiska, planted by the Japanese before they slipped away. Back on the island, terrified men fired at anything that moved, and the muzzle flashes drew more fire. Some units radioed headquarters that they were under attack from all sides by a large Japanese force. But every one of those attacks was friendly fire, and no single commander could see the whole picture. The fog that had protected the Japanese evacuation now protected the chaos from the eyes of command. By the third day, the shooting finally began to taper off as the island was secured sector by sector. What they found on the island confirmed what some had suspected all along: there was no enemy to fight. Empty bunkers, abandoned equipment, and booby traps, but not a single Japanese soldier remained on Kiska. The invasion of Kiska had cost the Allies more than 300 casualties, every one of them inflicted by their own side. The final toll on Kiska would be recorded as 313 casualties, a figure that shocked the Allied High Command. Of that number, 28 American soldiers and 4 Canadian soldiers were killed in action on the island. The rest were wounded, many of them hit by their own countrymen who could not see past the fog. Beyond the island, the campaign had cost the Navy dearly, most tragically on the destroyer USS Narrated. On the 18th of August, the ship struck a Japanese mine and lost 71 of its crew in the explosion. The minefield that claimed Narrated had been laid by the Japanese weeks earlier as part of their careful withdrawal. So in total, the liberation of Kiska cost the Allies more than 500 casualties across land and sea. Meanwhile, the Japanese forces that had garrisoned Kiska slipped away to fight another day, largely untouched. The evacuation from Kiska had been one of the most skillfully executed operations of the entire Pacific War. Under the cover of fog, the Japanese had ferried their entire garrison off the island without a single loss. That success came down to timing, deception, and the same weather that would later blind the Allied invasion force. The Japanese commander who planned the withdrawal, Rear Admiral Cottage, had gambled everything on secrecy and speed. He moved his garrison under the noses of Allied patrols, exploiting every gap in their reconnaissance coverage. When the Allies finally occupied Kiska, they found a fully stocked base that the Japanese had abandoned in haste. The equipment, supplies, and even vehicles left behind spoke to an evacuation that was rapid but remarkably orderly. And that left the Allied commanders with a difficult question: how had an entire garrison vanished without being detected? The answer lay in a Japanese deception so complete that even their own radio operators were fooled. The Japanese left their radio sets transmitting on schedule, so Allied intercepts heard a garrison that no longer existed. They even left behind a number of watchdogs on the island, whose barking made patrols believe the base was still manned. Intelligence officers studied the intercepted traffic and concluded the garrison was still at full strength. That faulty picture drove the decision to mount a full-scale invasion of an island that was already empty. On the 15th of August, 1943, the invasion force began its assault through the morning fog. The fleet had rehearsed the landings, but on the day of the invasion, the weather turned against them completely. Landing craft drifted off course, units came ashore at the wrong beaches, and the chain of command broke down. With visibility down to a few dozen yards, soldiers could not tell friend from foe in the murk. The first firefights broke out within hours of the landings as nervous troops opened up on shadows. One American unit, believing it had found a Japanese camp, stormed a position that turned out to be occupied by their own men. The confusion spread so fast that entire battalions lost track of where their own lines actually were. Aircraft overhead reported enemy columns on the move, but the columns were Allied troops advancing on schedule. Each mistaken report fed the next, so that the picture of the battlefield grew more distorted by the hour. And through it all, the only Japanese on Kiska were the booby traps and mines they had left behind. Those hidden devices would claim their own share of the invasion force in the days that followed. The booby-trapped ammunition dumps and rigged bunkers turned routine patrols into deadly guessing games for the invaders. One of the most tragic losses came on the night of the 21st of August, aboard the destroyer USS Abner Reed. The vessel struck a Japanese mine that tore open her stern, and 71 crewmen were lost in the blast and the water. That minefield had been laid by the Japanese weeks earlier as a parting gift during their silent withdrawal. When the final tally was made, the liberation of Kiska had cost the Allies well over 500 casualties. And not one of those losses was inflicted by a Japanese soldier on the island that day. It stands as the most lopsided engagement of the Pacific campaign, measured purely in friendly fire. But the story of Kiska did not end with the last shot fired in the fog. For the thousands of soldiers who fought a phantom enemy, the psychological scars lasted far longer than the battle. Many of them would spend the rest of the war wondering whether the men they shot had been friends or strangers. The operation was hastily scrubbed from the record, buried beneath the greater battles of the Pacific War. Few Americans today know that their country once invaded an empty island and fought itself for 3 days. Yet the lessons of Kiska would echo through every future amphibious operation the Allies launched. The chaos of Kiska pushed military planners to demand better identification, better maps, and better communication. And in the larger reckoning, it exposed how even the mightiest army can be undone by bad information. But before we close the book on Kiska, there is one more chapter that almost no one has ever heard. That hidden chapter concerns the very first shots of the invasion, fired before most troops even reached the beach. As the transports approached Kiska, an American destroyer opened fire on a radar contact that turned out to be a friendly vessel. The shells fell short of their mark, but the episode set the tone for everything that followed on the island. A Canadian infantry brigade came ashore at the wrong beach and spent hours trying to locate its own command post. Meanwhile, an American battalion, separated from its radios, marched straight into the middle of a Canadian defensive line. Both sides opened fire in the confusion, and the exchange lasted well into the night before it was sorted out. In the end, the day's landing had claimed the lives of more than 24 Allied soldiers, every one of them by friendly fire. Adding to the tragedy, a landing craft struck a submerged rock and capsized, drowning several soldiers in the icy water. The cold of the Bering Sea was a killer in its own right, claiming men who might otherwise have survived the landing. By the second day, the invasion force had split into small bands wandering the island, each convinced the enemy was near. Every rustle in the brush and every shadow in the mist became a target for men whose nerves were stretched to the breaking point. A Canadian soldier later recalled that his unit spent an entire night trading fire with what turned out to be an empty ridge. The ridge returned no fire because no one was there, yet the ammunition spent that night was very real. Somewhere in that chaos, the fog and the fear produced the invasion's single worst friendly fire incident of the entire operation. Accounts differ on the exact details, but the result was the same, a bitter cost paid by men who wore the same uniform. And when the fog finally lifted on the third day, the truth of Kiska began to dawn on the men who had fought so hard to take it. When the mist finally cleared, the soldiers of the invasion force found an island that was utterly, eerily silent. The Japanese positions stood empty, their guns still pointing seaward, their kettles still warm on abandoned stoves. The enemy had not merely retreated, they had vanished with a precision that left the island looking untouched. To understand that vanishing act, we have to look at the night of July 28, 1943. Under the cover of a thick fog bank, 2 Japanese cruisers and a dozen destroyers slipped into Kiska's harbor. They had come to pull out more than 5,000 soldiers and their equipment in a single night's work. Every man boarded in absolute silence, with orders to leave all lights off and no sound above a whisper. The Americans, watching from their ships miles away, never saw a single sign that the evacuation was underway. By dawn, the entire Japanese garrison had boarded the waiting ships and slipped back out through the fog. In a single night, the Japanese had achieved what the Allies had spent weeks trying to prevent. The Allied command had been certain that any evacuation would be detected by their submarines and aircraft. But the fog that had plagued the invasion also shielded the retreat, hiding the Japanese ships from every watchful eye. Even as the Japanese sailed home, the Allies were still massing 34,000 troops for an invasion of an empty island. The intelligence failure was staggering, and it would not be fully understood until the fighting had already begun. Radio intercepts had hinted at the withdrawal, but the analysts dismissed them as Japanese deception. So convinced were the planners that the enemy remained, they sent the invasion forward on schedule into the waiting fog. On the morning of August 16th, the first wave of the invasion force began its run toward Kiska's beaches. The operation, code-named Cottage, represented the largest invasion force the Allies had yet assembled in the Pacific. Naval gunfire thundered against the shore for nearly an hour before the first troops even touched the sand. The bombardment was aimed at Japanese gun positions that the defenders had abandoned weeks before. One American landing craft struck a reef and went down, and the troops aboard were not wearing their life belts. The icy water claimed several of those men within minutes, a loss the enemy had nothing to do with. By midday, the landing force had pushed inland, expecting to meet the Japanese at any moment. Instead of the enemy, they found abandoned bunkers, stacked ammunition, and empty foxholes everywhere they looked. To the nervous invaders, this looked less like an empty island and more like a trap waiting to spring. Their commanders had warned them the Japanese were expert at camouflage and ambush, so the emptiness felt deeply wrong. So the invasion force kept its guard up, and that constant vigilance became the engine of the tragedy. On the night of August 17th, a group of American soldiers heard what they believed was a Japanese challenge in the dark. They answered with a burst of rifle fire, and the exchange that followed killed 4 of their own men. The men they had fired at were fellow Americans, lost in the same fog and frightened by the very same noises. By the time the island was declared secure, the toll had reached more than 300 Allied casualties. And the enemy they had come to fight, all 5,000 of them, were already back in Japan drinking tea. But the story of Kiska does not end with the friendly fire, because the hardest questions were yet to be answered. The first question was how the Japanese had moved 5,000 men without a single Allied ship or plane spotting them. The answer lay partly in the weather, for the Aleutian fog was so reliable that it had become a weapon in itself. Japanese planners had studied the local conditions for months and knew exactly when the fog would be at its thickest. They had timed the evacuation to the night of July 28th, when visibility dropped to nearly zero. Even so, the risk was enormous, because Allied submarines were known to patrol the waters around the island. The Japanese commander gambled that the fog would blind the submarines just as surely as it blinded everyone else. And the gamble paid off, for the submarines reported nothing unusual on the night the convoy slipped through. The second question was why the Allied intelligence services had refused to believe their own intercepts. American codebreakers had actually decoded Japanese messages that pointed directly to a planned withdrawal. But those messages were judged as deliberate deception, a trick to lure the invasion force into a trap. The analysts reasoned that no commander would abandon a position the enemy was about to attack in force. That reasoning ignored a crucial fact that the Japanese had already decided Kiska was not worth defending. After the fall of Attu, the Japanese High Command had judged the Aleutian outpost a strategic liability. Supplying the garrison was consuming shipping the Japanese could no longer spare for so remote a post. So the garrison was ordered home, and the entire invasion was built on a premise that had already collapsed. So the invasion force stormed ashore onto an island whose defenders had already sailed away into the night. And that left the third question, the hardest one of all, about the men who died in that fog. The question was whether the entire operation could have been avoided if the truth had been believed. After the war, American historians studying the Aleutian campaign reached a sobering conclusion. The official army history of the campaign judged that the invasion had been unnecessary from the start. Yet the operation did serve one purpose, though it was a purpose no commander would have chosen. The invasion proved that the Aleutians could be taken, but it also exposed how fragile Allied coordination could be. For the families who lost men at Kiska, the knowledge that the enemy was never there made the grief harder to bear. The final casualty count for Operation Cottage stood at more than 300 Allied dead and wounded. Of those, the official records attribute the great majority to friendly fire in the fog and the dark. The Japanese garrison, by contrast, listed barely a handful of casualties from the entire campaign on Kiska. Nearly all of their losses came from the Allied bombardment, not from any ground fighting on the island. So the balance of the entire Aleutian campaign stood in stark and uncomfortable contrast. The Allies suffered more than 300 casualties, taking back an island that was already theirs. The lessons of Kiska would ripple through the rest of the war and into how later invasions were planned. And the biggest lesson was that fog and fear can be a more dangerous enemy than any army on the ground. And that lesson took hold immediately. For the very next month, the Allies began planning for the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. Commanders who had studied Kiska insisted on far better reconnaissance before any Pacific landing was attempted. The tragedy at Kiska also reshaped how the Allies treated the reports of their own intelligence services. But the deeper lesson of Kiska reached far beyond the Pacific, into the very heart of how wars are fought. For the fact was that the Aleutian campaign had consumed enormous resources for an objective that was never contested. Historians later calculated that the Allies had committed tens of thousands of men to retake islands that held little strategic value. Some military analysts argued the entire diversion had been a Japanese masterstroke of strategic misdirection. After all, the Japanese had drawn a large Allied force thousands of miles away from the decisive Central Pacific. Yet that reading credits the Japanese with a plan they may never have intended in the first place. The evidence suggests the Aleutian seizure was more improvisation than grand design, a gamble that simply paid off. What is certain is that the fog of Kiska had done what no enemy army could accomplish. It had turned 34,000 trained soldiers into a frightened army firing at shadows. And it had produced the deepest irony of the entire campaign, that the very fog which hid the enemy also hid the truth. Even today, the story of Kiska stands as a cautionary tale taught in military academies around the world. Cadets study it to learn how fear and uncertainty can undo the best-laid plans of any command. And they learn that sometimes the hardest battle is not against an enemy, but against what you cannot see. And the story of Kiska did not end when the shooting finally stopped on that fog-shrouded shore. In the weeks that followed, salvage crews and burial teams moved across the island under a heavy, persistent overcast. They recovered the bodies of the Allied soldiers and buried them with full military honors in a single cemetery. The cemetery at Kiska would hold the men of both nations who had fallen in the campaign. The remains of the American and Canadian soldiers lay together, their cause the same, their enemy absent. In time, the United States would relocate these remains to the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. Today, Kiska itself lies empty, a windswept wilderness where the wreckage of war still rusts in the rain. The island is now part of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, protected and largely unvisited. Yet its rusting guns and decaying bunkers still stand as silent monuments to a battle that never was. The Japanese who had built those defenses had slipped away so quietly that not even the patrols noticed. Their evacuation, carried out under cover of fog, remains one of the most successful withdrawals of the war. Historians at the Naval History and Heritage Command rank the Kiska evacuation among the finest of the Pacific War. The Japanese moved more than 5,000 men off the island in under an hour under the enemy's very nose. That single hour of disciplined evacuation undid months of Allied planning and preparation. And it left the Allied commanders with a bitter question they could never fully answer. How had 5,000 men vanished from an island under constant Allied watch without a single alarm being raised? The answer to that question lay in the discipline and silence of a navy that had trained for years. The Japanese had rehearsed night evacuations for months, drills that would prove their worth on this very night. Every man knew his exact position, his exact load, and the exact second he was to move. The evacuation plan had been written with the kind of precision normally reserved for an invasion itself. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, had studied the Allied patrol schedules with care. He knew the gaps in the Allied watch, the hours when the fog made aerial reconnaissance blind. On the night of the withdrawal, thick weather blanketed the island and the sea around it. The Japanese loaded their men into submarines and transports in a tightly choreographed sequence. Every piece of heavy equipment was left behind, destroyed or abandoned to keep the loading quick. The Japanese deliberately left their campfires burning and their radios transmitting normal traffic. These deceptions were designed to make the island look fully occupied to any watching aircraft. In less than an hour, the entire garrison was aboard, and the convoy slipped away into the fog. By the time the fog lifted, the island was empty, and the Japanese were already far to the west. The Allied commanders, still convinced the enemy was present, ordered the invasion to proceed as planned. So on the 15th of August, the largest invasion force of the Aleutian campaign hit the beaches of Kiska. And what they found on that empty island would set in motion the strangest battle of the Pacific War. The landing craft came ashore under a cold drizzle, and the first men to hit the beach found nothing waiting for them. Expecting a fierce fight, the invasion force pushed inland, only to find abandoned bunkers and silent gun positions. The first patrols radioed back that the island appeared deserted, but their commanders refused to believe the report. They assumed the Japanese had pulled back into the hills to spring an ambush from the high ground. The American command, certain the enemy was hiding, ordered the troops to advance with utmost caution and fire on any movement. In that thick fog, a moving shape meant an enemy, and so soldiers opened fire on their own comrades. The first exchange of fire came when a nervous American unit engaged what it thought was a Japanese patrol. Within hours, the confusion spread across the entire island as separate units began firing on each other. One of the deadliest incidents came when a naval bombardment, meant to soften the beaches, landed among Allied troops. The destroyer USS WWII struck a Japanese mine while patrolling the approaches, adding to the day's mounting losses. The mine had been laid by the Japanese before they left, a parting gift meant to wound the invasion fleet. 71 sailors on the WWII were killed or wounded, many of them in the blast that tore the stern apart. It was the only ship lost by the United States Navy in the entire Aleutian campaign. Meanwhile, on land, the fog continued to play tricks on men who had been told to expect an enemy around every corner. Men fired at shadows, at rocks, at dogs left behind by the Japanese garrison that wandered the empty island. By the end of the first day, dozens of Allied soldiers had been cut down by the guns of their own side. The second day brought no relief, only more fog and the same terrible uncertainty in every direction. A Canadian unit, moving to outflank what it thought was a Japanese strongpoint, walked straight into American fire. The two Allied forces, fighting side by side in the campaign, had no way to tell friend from foe in the murk. Troops fired at anything that moved, and in the fog, nearly everything seemed to move. In one grim episode, a mortar barrage called into silence, an enemy position fell on friendly troops instead. Radio discipline broke down as anxious units called in fire on coordinates they could not actually see. By the time the third day began, the island had effectively become a battlefield with no enemy on it at all. Only on the 18th of August, did the Allied commanders finally begin to accept that the island was empty. The order went out to cease fire, and one by one, the nervous units were told to stand down. When the final count was made, the butcher's bill of Kiska came to over 300 Allied casualties. Nearly all of them had been inflicted by their own side, in a battle fought against an enemy long gone. The only Japanese losses on Kiska came from the mines and booby traps they had left behind. The Japanese garrison had escaped to fight again, and their commander had pulled off a perfect withdrawal. For the Allies, Kiska became a painful lesson in what happens when intelligence and caution go wrong together. The Aleutian campaign quietly faded from the headlines, overshadowed by the great battles of the Central Pacific. Yet the story of Kiska endures as one of the most remarkable and tragic blunders in the history of modern war. Historians still debate the exact number, but the official toll of Operation Cottage stands at over 300 casualties. Of those, the vast majority were American and Canadian soldiers struck down by the fire of their own allies. The official inquiry that followed catalogued the mistakes, but it could not bring a single one of the fallen back. Yet Kiska taught the Allied High Command a lesson that would echo through every later amphibious invasion of the war. From the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific, commanders now insisted on stricter identification of troops in the field. The tragedy also forced the military to confront how easily fear and fog could turn disciplined soldiers into a danger to one another. In the years that followed, military historians studied Kiska as a textbook case of what is now called blue-on-blue fire. The term itself came to symbolize every friendly fire tragedy, but Kiska remains its most famous and most avoidable example. For the families of the men who fell on Kiska, the pain was sharpened by the knowledge that the enemy had never even been there. The island itself, returned to its cold silence, became a memorial to one of the strangest battles ever fought. Today, the Aleutian campaign is largely forgotten, a footnote in the vast story of the Pacific War. But the veterans who served there never forgot the 3 days they spent fighting ghosts in the fog. Their accounts, recorded in later interviews, describe the confusion and sorrow that followed the ceaseless fire. One of the great ironies of Kiska is that both sides, in their own way, achieved what they set out to do. The Japanese escaped to fight again, and the Allies reclaimed the island, yet neither outcome felt like a victory. And that is the true measure of Operation Cottage, a campaign won against an enemy who was never there. In the decades since, historians have pointed to Kiska as a warning about the limits of even the best-laid plans. The official United States Army history of the Aleutian campaign records the full scale of the friendly fire toll. That figure includes 105 men killed in action, with the rest wounded in the 3 days of confusion. 2 United States Navy ships also struck mines laid by the retreating Japanese, adding to the cost of the operation. The destroyer Narrated lost its entire stern to a single mine, taking the lives of more than 70 sailors. So of the more than 300 casualties of Operation Cottage, the Japanese cause was almost none of them. The Japanese had lost only a handful of men on Kiska, nearly all to their own mines and booby traps. The evacuation itself remains one of the most skillfully executed withdrawals of the entire Pacific War. Under the cover of the same fog that later doomed the Allies, the Japanese slipped away on their own transports. They evacuated more than 5,000 troops without losing a single man to the Allied blockade. The Allied Navy, watching the island through the fog, never detected the movement at all. It was a stunning failure of surveillance, and it set the stage for the tragedy that followed the landing. The lesson of Kiska reached far beyond the Aleutians and shaped how later invasions were planned. Commanders in every theater now demanded clearer markings, better maps, and far more careful coordination. Yet even with those reforms, the fog of war never fully lifted for any army in the years that followed. And so Operation Cottage stands as a permanent reminder of what fear, fog, and bad intelligence can cost. And so, in the cold quiet of the Aleutian fog, the strangest battle of the Pacific War came to its end. The men who survived carried the memory of those 3 days with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it openly, others stayed silent about what the fog had made them do to their own comrades. In 1986, the United States Navy placed a memorial on Kiska to honor those who fell there. Today, the island remains largely uninhabited, its abandoned buildings slowly reclaimed by the weather. Historians still visit Kiska, walking the same ridges where men once fired at shadows in the mist. The National Park Service now manages Kiska as part of a World War II historic landmark. Yet the deeper lesson of Kiska is not about the island itself, but about the nature of war. It reminds us that in battle, information is the most precious weapon and confusion the most deadly enemy. Operation Cottage stands as a warning that even victory can be hollow when bought with the lives of friends. If this forgotten battle surprised you, there are many more strange and little-known stories waiting in the archives. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which forgotten front you want us to uncover next.